She was 78 years old, and the bank had just taken her home. 51 years of memories packed into a single suitcase and a wooden chair her late husband built with his own hands. She had $47 left, no savings, no plan. And somehow she spent 10 of those dollars on a rusted metal structure hidden deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Everyone said she was out of her mind. But what they didn't know was that the place she bought for $10 was hiding something her husband had been preparing for decades. Before we go on, if stories like this one speak to you, take a moment and subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight. We love knowing how far a good story can travel. On the morning the bank officer arrived, Margery Hollowell was sitting on the front porch in a wooden chair her husband had built 30 years ago. The chair was simple. Oak, smooth armrests worn down by decades of palms resting on them. 2 coats of varnish that had long since faded to a soft golden color. The kind that only comes from years of sun and weather and use. She had a cup of coffee in her hand, and she was watching the dogwood tree at the end of the driveway. It had just started blooming. Small white flowers against the gray Virginia sky, fragile and stubborn at the same time. The bank officer's car pulled into the driveway slowly, like even the vehicle knew it didn't want to be there. A young man stepped out. He wore a navy suit that didn't quite fit at the shoulders, and he carried a manila folder pressed flat against his chest. He walked up the porch steps and stopped a few feet away from Margery, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Mrs. Hollowell, I'm sorry to bother you this morning." Margery didn't look up. She took a sip of her coffee. "I know why you're here." The young man opened the folder and held out a document. The words across the top were printed in bold. Notice of foreclosure. Beneath them in smaller type, the address of the house she and Herschel had moved into in the spring of 1973, back when the dogwood tree was just a stick in the ground, and the kitchen still smelled of fresh paint. "The remaining medical balance is $280,000, ma'am. The bank has filed for possession of the property effective." "I know the number." Margery's voice was steady, but her fingers tightened around the cup. "I've known the number since before my husband's body was cold." The young man looked down at his shoes. He didn't say anything else. He placed the document on the porch railing, turned, and walked back to his car. Margery watched him drive away. Then she looked down at the foreclosure notice fluttering slightly in the April breeze, and she felt something very old and very heavy settle into her chest. Not surprise. She had known this was coming for months. Just wait. The kind of wait that arrives when the last door finally closes behind you. Herschel James Hollowell had died 4 months earlier in December, 3 days before Christmas. Lung cancer. The diagnosis came fast. The treatment came faster. And the bills came fastest of all. 17 months of chemotherapy, hospital stays, ambulance rides, specialist consultations, prescriptions with names Margery couldn't pronounce, and prices she couldn't believe. The insurance covered some of it. Not enough. Not nearly enough. By the time Herschel passed, the savings account they had built together across 5 decades was empty. The life insurance had already been signed over to the hospital. And the equity in the house, their house, the one Herschel had re-roofed twice with his own hands. The one where Jolene took her first steps. The one with the porch he built, because Margery once said she liked the idea of drinking coffee outside, was the last thing the bank could take. So they took it. And now Margery Hollowell, retired. Schoolteacher widow, 78 years old, was sitting on her porch for the last time, holding a cup of coffee that was growing cold, watching the dogwood tree that she would never see bloom again. She stayed there for a long time. The afternoon light shifted slowly across the yard. Shadows stretched from the fence posts. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started up, then stopped again. The neighborhood sounded the way it always did. Ordinary, continuing, as if nothing had changed at all. Around 3 o'clock, Margery went inside. The house was mostly empty now. The furniture had been sold off over the past 2 weeks. The bookshelves Herschel made were gone. The kitchen table was gone. The bedroom dresser with the sticky second drawer was gone. All that remained were a few cardboard boxes by the door, a suitcase and the wooden chair on the porch. Margery stood in the hallway and let her eyes move from room to room. Every wall held a ghost. The kitchen door frame where they had penciled Jolene's height every birthday until she turned 12 and asked them to stop. The window above the sink where Margery used to watch Herschel working in the backyard, sawdust in his hair, a pencil behind his ear. The living room floor where they had danced once badly on their 25th anniversary with no music playing at all. She didn't cry. She had done her crying. 4 months of it. Crying in bed at 3 in the morning. Crying in the grocery store when she passed the brand of coffee Herschel liked. Crying in the shower where no one could hear her. She had cried so much that her body seemed to have simply decided it was finished. What she felt now was something quieter than sadness, something heavier. She felt invisible. Her daughter Jolene had called the week before. The conversation had been careful, the way conversations become when people are trying to say something kind without offering too much. "Mom, you can come stay with me in Richmond. I've got the couch. We'll figure it out." But there had been a pause before the word couch. A tiny hesitation. And in that hesitation, Margery heard everything Jolene didn't say. The apartment was small. Jolene's own life was complicated. Having a 78-year-old mother on the couch was not a plan. It was a last resort. Margery had said, "I'll think about it, sweetheart." She had no intention of thinking about it. She had spent her whole life refusing to be a burden. She wasn't going to start now. So she stood in the empty hallway with nowhere to go, $47 in her wallet, and the quiet understanding that for the first time in her life, the world had no place for her. That is when she found the letter. Margery had been cleaning out the last drawer of Herschel's workbench in the garage. Most of his tools had already been sold. The bench itself would stay with the house, but the bottom drawer was stuck the way it had always been stuck, requiring a firm pull and a slight lift on the left side. A trick only Margery and Herschel knew. Inside was the usual clutter: old sandpaper, a broken tape measure, a handful of wood screws in a rusted tin. But beneath all of it, pressed flat against the bottom of the drawer, was an envelope, cream-colored, sealed. On the front, in Herschel's slow, careful handwriting, were 4 words. Marge opened when ready. Her breath stopped. She recognized the handwriting instantly. The slightly uneven letters, the way he always wrote her name with the tail of the E curling upward like a small wave. She turned the envelope over. It was sealed with tape, yellowed with age. This had been here for a long time. Margery carried the envelope inside and sat down on the floor of the empty living room. She had no chair, no table. Just the bare carpet and the late afternoon light falling through the curtainless window. She held the envelope in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it, heavier than paper alone. Then she opened it. Inside were 2 things: a single sheet of paper covered in Herschel's handwriting and a hand-drawn map folded into quarters. Margery unfolded the letter first. "Marge, if you are reading this, it means I'm gone. And if I know you, and I've known you for 53 years, so I think I do, you're probably sitting somewhere worrying about what comes next. You're probably thinking you're a burden. You're probably thinking there's nowhere left. So I need to tell you something. I should have told you while I could still say it out loud. I kept a promise. Do you remember the spring of 1971? We drove through the Blue Ridge on our honeymoon. We stopped in that little town with the diner on the hill. You said you loved the mountains. I said I'd build you a house up there someday. You laughed. I didn't. 3 years later, I bought a piece of land near that town. It wasn't much, just a few acres with an old metal building on it. I paid almost nothing for it. I never told you because I wanted it to be finished before you saw it. But life kept moving, and I never got around to finishing. I'm sorry for that. What I did do was prepare. The map will show you where it is. There's a key taped to the back of this page. The taxes owed on the property come to $10. Go to the county office and pay it, and the land becomes yours. Legally, fully, completely yours. It's not much, Marge. but it's something no one can take away from you. A place to stand. I love you. I always did, even when I forgot to say it. Herschel. Margery read the letter 3 times. On the first reading, the words didn't fully register. On the second, her hands began to tremble. On the third, she pressed the paper against her chest and sat very still, breathing slowly, feeling the presence of a man who had been gone for 4 months, but who was somehow still thinking of her. She turned the page over. Taped to the back, just as he said, was a small iron key, dark with age, cold against her fingertips. The map was simple. A road marked in pencil, a turn onto something called Old Forge Trail, a small rectangle drawn at the end of a dotted line labeled with one word in Herschel's hand, home. Margery sat on the floor until the room grew dark around her. The dogwood tree outside the window was just a silhouette now against the deepening sky. She held the key in one hand and the map in the other, and for the first time in months, the weight in her chest shifted. Not gone, not lighter exactly, but different. Like a door had opened somewhere far away and a draft was moving through the room. She decided that night. The next morning, Margery placed $7 on the counter of the Greyhound station and bought a one-way ticket deeper into the mountains. The bus left at 9:15. She was the first passenger to board. She carried the suitcase in one hand and the wooden chair tucked under her other arm. The driver looked at the chair, then at her, then at the chair again. He opened his mouth to say something, maybe a rule about luggage, maybe a question about why a woman her age was carrying furniture onto a Greyhound bus. But something in Margery's face stopped him. He just nodded and stepped aside. She placed the chair in the aisle beside her seat and rode in silence for 3 hours. The Virginia landscape rolled past the window. First the suburbs, strip malls and car dealerships, then farmland. Long stretches of fence and green pasture and barns with rusted roofs. Then the mountains began. Slowly at first, just gentle ridges in the distance, blue-gray against the horizon. Then closer, steeper, covered in pine and oak, the road narrowing as it climbed. Margery watched it all without speaking. The envelope rested in her lap. The iron key sat in her coat pocket, and every now and then her fingers found it there, turning it over slowly, feeling the cold weight of it. She thought about Herschel. Not the Herschel of the hospital bed, thin and gray, his voice reduced to a whisper, but the Herschel of 1971. Young, broad-shouldered, laughing as he drove their borrowed car through the mountains with the windows down and the radio playing something she couldn't remember anymore. She thought about the afternoon they stopped in that small town, the one with the diner on the hill. How they sat on a bench outside and watched the sunset turn the ridgeline gold. How Herschel had put his arm around her and said, quiet and serious, "Someday, Marge, I'll build you a place right up there." She had kissed his cheek and laughed. Because that's what you do when you're 24 and someone promises you a house on a mountain. You laugh and you love them and you forget about it. Herschel didn't forget. The bus stopped at the edge of a town so small it barely had a name. Margery stepped off with her suitcase and her chair and stood on the shoulder of the road for a moment looking around. One main street, a diner with a hand-painted sign, a hardware store with a tin roof, a brick building with gold letters on the window that read, County Administrative Offices. She walked to the county office first. Inside, a woman in her 60s sat behind a wooden desk stacked with folders. She had reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a nameplate that said Dorothea Ainsley County Records. Margery placed the letter on the desk. "I need to claim a piece of property. The taxes owed are $10. Dorothea picked up the letter, read it slowly, then looked up. Her eyes moved from the letter to Margery to the wooden chair tucked under her arm. "Mrs. Hollowell, are you certain about this? The property has no utilities, no paved access, no registered livable structure. And if I'm being frank with you, ma'am, the terrain up there isn't easy even for someone half your age." Margery reached into her wallet and placed a $10 bill on the desk, crisp and flat as though she had been saving it for exactly this purpose. At my age, there isn't much left that scares me. Dorothea looked at the bill for a long time. Then she looked at Margery again, and something shifted in her expression. Not pity, something closer to recognition. She pulled a form from the stack beside her and began filling it out. Then let's make it official. Margery signed her name where Dorothea pointed. The pen moved slowly but steadily across the page. When she finished, Dorothea slid the form into a folder and closed it. The property is yours, Mrs. Hollowell, legally and completely. Margery tucked the chair under her arm, picked up a suitcase, and walked toward the door. Mrs. Hollowell? Margery turned. Dorothea hesitated, then spoke carefully. There's a man in town named Clyde Fenton. Runs the hardware store. He knew your husband a long time ago. If you need anything up there, he's the one to ask. Margery nodded once. Then she stepped outside into the cool mountain air and began walking toward the trail marked on Herschel's map. The walk took longer than she expected. Old Forge Trail was not much of a trail at all, just two shallow ruts in the earth, half covered by grass and wild fern. The suitcase bumped against her shin with every step. The chair grew heavier under her arm. Her knees ached. Her breathing came in short, shallow pulls that she tried to hide from no one in particular. But she kept walking. The forest closed in around her. Tall oaks and Virginia pines, their branches knitting together overhead, until the sky was just a ribbon of gray between the leaves. The air smelled of damp earth and moss, and something faintly sweet like the last traces of wildflowers giving way to spring. After nearly an hour, the trail faded into the undergrowth completely. Margery stopped. She unfolded the map with one hand and studied it. The rectangle Herschel had drawn was close now. Just past the next ridge through a stand of hickory trees. She pushed forward. Branches scratched at her coat. The suitcase caught on a root and she stumbled, catching herself against a tree trunk. Her palms scraped against the bark. She stood there for a moment, breathing hard, 78 years of living, pressing down on her shoulders. Then she stepped through the last line of trees and into a clearing, and she saw it. The structure sat in the middle of the open ground, like something the forest had tried to swallow and failed. A long curved building made of corrugated metal, stained dark with rust, leaning slightly to one side, as if exhausted by the effort of standing. Weeds climbed the walls. Two narrow windows on the near side were cracked and clouded. The front had a pair of wide metal doors, chained shut, the chain thick with orange corrosion. Margery set the suitcase down. She lowered the chair to the ground beside her. For a long time she just stood there staring. It was ugly. It was broken. It was possibly the most neglected building she had ever seen, and it was hers. The wind moved through the clearing, bending the tall grass in slow waves. Somewhere in the trees behind her, a cardinal sang two notes and stopped. The mountains stretched out beyond the clearing, in long blue ridges layered against each other, like folds of cloth disappearing into the distance. Margery reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the iron key. She looked at the building. She looked at the key, and something rose inside her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not hope exactly, something before hope, something more fragile. The feeling you get when you realize that the person you loved most in this world was still taking care of you, even from the other side of silence. She picked up the chair, walked across the clearing, set it down in front of those rusted doors, and sat. Just for a minute, just to catch her breath. Then Margery Hollowell, 78 years old, alone on a mountain with $37 and an iron key, leaned forward, slid the key into the lock, and turned it. The mechanism resisted. Metal ground against metal. Her wrist ached. She gripped harder, twisted again. For a moment, nothing. Then the lock gave way with a deep, heavy sound that echoed across the clearing and rolled into the trees like a slow drumbeat. The chain slid free. The doors groaned open, and cold, dark air poured out of the building like a breath that had been held for 35 years. Margery stood at the threshold, peering into the shadows. She couldn't see much, Just the faint outline of a concrete floor stretching into darkness, and a single thin beam of light falling from a crack in the roof, cutting through the dust like a blade. She took one step inside, then another. Her footsteps echoed in the enormous empty space. The sound bounced off the curved metal walls and came back to her like a second pair of feet walking somewhere just ahead. The building was vast, much larger than it looked from outside. A cathedral of rust and silence. And there, sitting in the center of the floor, right in that single column of pale light, was something that didn't belong. Something that had been placed there deliberately. Something that had been waiting. A wooden crate. Small, roughly the size of a toolbox, sitting on the concrete floor, as if someone had placed it there with care and walked away. The wood was dark with age, the grain swollen and cracked in places, but the construction was unmistakable. Dovetail joints, hand-cut edges, no nails. This was Herschel's work. Margery would have recognized it blindfolded. She crossed the floor slowly, her footsteps filling the hollow space with small repeating echoes. The beam of light from the cracked roof fell directly onto the crate, as though the building itself were pointing at it. Dust swirled lazily in the column of pale gold. The air tasted of rust and old concrete and decades of stillness. Margery knelt beside the crate. Her knees complained. She ignored them. The lid had no latch, no lock. Just two strips of leather holding it down dry and stiff as old bone. She worked them loose with shaking fingers and lifted the lid. Glass jars, a dozen of them, maybe more, packed in tight rows with straw stuffed between them for padding. The kind of wide-mouth mason jars she had used for decades to put up tomatoes and peach preserves. At first she thought they were empty. Then she lifted one, and the weight of it surprised her so much she nearly dropped it. She held the jar up toward the light, inside rolled tightly, and stacked one against another, like small pale logs were bundles of paper. Green paper. Margery unscrewed the lid. The seal broke with a faint hiss, as if the jar had been holding its breath. She reached in and pulled out a single roll. $20 bills. She counted them slowly, her lips moving without sound. 50 bills. $1,000. She looked back at the crate. 12 jars, some with multiple rolls. Her mind refused the arithmetic. Not because she couldn't do it, she had taught third-grade math for 31 years. But because the number it produced didn't belong in the same world as the woman kneeling on a concrete floor with $37 in her wallet. Margery placed the bundle back into the jar and screwed the lid shut. Then she sat down on the cold floor, set the jar beside her, and pressed both palms flat against the concrete as if she needed to make sure the ground was real. Beneath the jars at the very bottom of the crate, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was something else. A leather notebook, thick soft covered, the edges rubbed smooth. On the front, stamped in faded gold letters that caught the light for just a moment before disappearing again, Herschel J. Hollowell. She opened it. The first page was not a sketch or a measurement or a list. It was a letter written in the same careful hand as the one she had found in the drawer, but longer, more detailed, and dated 11 years ago. Marge. By now you found the jars. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I should have told you. Maybe you're right, but here is the truth of it. Every side job I ever took, the bookshelves for the Davidsons, the porch railings for the church, the cabinets for that dentist in Roanoke who took 6 months to pay, I kept half the cash out of the bank. Not because I didn't trust you, because I didn't trust what could happen. Hospitals take bank accounts, Marge. Creditors take bank accounts. But they don't come looking in old buildings on mountains nobody remembers. This money is yours. I figure it's around $40,000. I lost exact count somewhere around year 20. Use it slowly. Use it carefully. Don't let anyone know how much there is. But the money isn't why I'm writing this. Turn the page. Margery turned the page. The rest of the journal was filled with drawings, floor plans, elevations, cross-sections, detailed sketches of walls, window frames, a kitchen counter, a wood stove installation, a rain catchment system, a root cellar. Every page was meticulous. every measurement labeled, every material listed with estimated costs in the margins. Herschel had designed an entire home inside this building, room by room, board by board. On the last page of drawings, a small note in the bottom corner read, "For Marge if the day comes when she needs a place the world can't take." Margery closed the journal and held it against her chest. She sat there in the dust and the silence for a very long time. The light from the roof shifted slowly across the floor, marking the hours she didn't bother to count. At some point, without deciding to, she began to cry. Not the way she had cried in the months after Herschel's death, desperate choking, muffled into pillows. This was different. Quiet tears that moved down her face without resistance, the way rain moves down glass. The kind of crying that isn't about loss anymore. The kind that comes when you discover that love was working on your behalf long before you knew you needed it. Eventually, the tears stopped. Margery wiped her face with the back of her hand, took a long, unsteady breath, and stood. She walked back to the entrance, retrieved the wooden chair from outside, carried it into the building, and set it down beside the crate. Then she sat in Herschel's chair, in Herschel's building on Herschel's land, and opened the journal to the first sketch. "All right," she said to the empty room. "Show me what to do." The next morning, Margery walked back to town. The hike took her nearly 90 minutes. By the time she reached the main street, her calves burned and her lower back had settled into a dull, persistent ache that she suspected would become a permanent companion. She went straight to the hardware store. The bell above the door rang as she entered. The smell hit her first: wood shavings, machine oil, the faint metallic tang of nails and screws stored in open bins. It was so close to the way Herschel's workshop used to smell that she had to stop in the doorway and steady herself against the frame. Behind the counter stood a man about 70, lean and tall, with hands that looked like they had been holding tools since childhood. Deep creases around his eyes, a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows. He was reading a newspaper, but looked up when the bell rang. "Help you. I need roofing sealant, a tarp heavy grade, a handsaw, and if you carry cast iron stovepipe, I'll take 8 feet of it." The man set the newspaper down. His eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a specific list. I have a specific problem." He studied her for a moment. Not her age, not her clothes, something else. Something behind her eyes. "You're up at the old place on Forge Trail." It wasn't a question. Small towns didn't need questions. They had observation. "My name is Margery Hollowell. My husband was Herschel Hollowell. He bought that property 35 years ago." The man's expression changed. Not dramatically, just a slight softening around the jaw, a loosening of something he had been holding in place. "Herschel Hollowell." He said the name the way people say the names of the dead when they respected them, slowly, with weight. "He helped me rebuild the back wall of this store in '04. Ice storm took half the roof and he showed up the next morning with lumber in his truck before I even called anyone. Wouldn't take a cent." He extended his hand. "Clyde Fenton." Margery shook it. His grip was firm but careful, the handshake of a man who understood the difference between strength and force. "I'll get your supplies together," Clyde said, stepping out from behind the counter. "But I'll tell you now, Mrs. Hollowell, a handsaw isn't going to get you far up there. You're going to need a circular saw, a level, and a drill at minimum. And you're going to need someone to show you which end of the drill goes into the wood. I taught school for 31 years, Mr. Fenton. I can learn." Something that might have been a smile moved briefly across his face. "I don't doubt that." Clyde loaded her supplies into his truck and drove her back up the mountain. He didn't offer. He simply picked up his keys and walked toward the door, and Margery understood that arguing would be a waste of both their time. At the property, Clyde walked the perimeter of the building in silence, studying the walls, the roof, the foundation. Margery followed 2 steps behind, watching him the way she used to watch Herschel when he assessed a new project, reading the structure, the way a doctor reads a patient. "Roof's your first priority. That crack is letting in moisture, and moisture will rot out whatever wood framing is still good underneath the metal. Seal it before anything else. He pointed toward the back corner. Foundation solid. Herschel poured this himself. I can tell by the finish. Man never did anything halfway. He showed her how to apply roofing sealant, how to spread it thick along the seam, working it into the gap with a putty knife, layering the tarp over the top, and weighting it with stones. The work was slow. The sealant was cold and stubborn. By the time Margery finished the first 3-foot section, her arms trembled, and her fingers were stiff and gray with dried compound. The patch was uneven, lumpy in places, thin in others. Clyde looked at it for a long moment. It'll hold through a light rain, maybe. Do it again. Margery scraped it off and started over. The second attempt was better. Not good, better. That one might survive a Tuesday, Clyde said. Try a third time, and we'll see if it lasts a weekend. Margery looked at him. He looked back, calm as a fence post. She did it a third time. Clyde left before dark. He didn't say goodbye. He just nodded, once climbed into his truck, and drove down the trail. On the passenger seat where Margery had been sitting, he left a small cardboard box she hadn't noticed him bring. Inside were a flashlight, 2 packages of batteries, a box of kitchen matches, and a bag of dried soup mix. She didn't notice it until the next morning, when she hiked down to move her suitcase from where she'd left it near the road. The box was sitting on the ground by the trail with a scrap of paper tucked underneath. Left front tire leaked. Had to stop. Forgot this. The tire hadn't leaked. Margery knew that. But she also knew that some people can only be generous when they pretend they're being careless. She carried the box back up the mountain and didn't mention it the next time she saw him. The days that followed had a pattern, though. Calling it a routine would have been generous. Margery woke each morning on the floor of the building, stiff and cold, the canvas tarps beneath her, doing little to soften the concrete. She boiled water over a small fire pit she had dug outside the entrance. Indoor fire was out of the question until the stovepipe was installed and the ventilation sorted. She ate simply. Soup. Bread from the diner in town carried up the mountain in her coat pockets. Canned beans she bought with careful counted bills from a single jar. Then she worked. The first real project after the roof patch was the stove. She had found it exactly where the outline described, an old cast-iron box, half buried under a pile of rusted tools and collapsed shelving near the back wall. Getting it free took an entire day. It weighed more than she did. She tried dragging it with a rope looped through the firebox opening. The rope snapped. She tried levering it with a length of pipe. The pipe bent. Finally, she wedged a flat stone under one edge, slid a plank beneath it, and inched it forward across the floor, one painful scraping foot at a time. By evening, the stove sat in the center of the building. Her shoulders ached so badly she couldn't lift her arms above her head. One fingernail was cracked and bleeding. The knees of her trousers were torn through. She sat in the wooden chair beside the stove, breathing hard, and opened Herschel's journal to the page marked Stovepipe Installation. His drawing showed a clean, straight pipe running from the stovetop through a reinforced collar in the roof. Simple on paper. In practice, Margery had no ladder tall enough to reach the inside of the curved ceiling. She would need to figure out something else. She closed the journal and sat in the quiet, listening to the wind outside. For a moment, the old familiar weight pressed down again. The voice that whispered, "What are you doing? You're 78. This is foolish. Call Jolene. Go to Richmond. Accept a couch and a smaller life." She let the voice speak. She didn't argue with it. She had learned a long time ago, in the first terrible weeks after Herschel's diagnosis, that fighting your own fear only makes it louder. Better to let it say its piece and then choose anyway. She chose. The next morning, she hiked down to Clyde's store and asked if he had a 12-foot ladder she could borrow. He did not lend her a ladder. What he did 2 days later was arrive at the property in his truck with the ladder, a retired plumber named Darnell Spivey, and a bag of chimney fittings he claimed had been sitting in the back of the shop taking up space. Darnell was 73, quiet and efficient. In 4 hours, he and Margery had the stovepipe fitted, sealed, and vented through a reinforced collar. He cut into the roof with a reciprocating saw that made a sound like an angry hornet. Margery held the pipe steady from below, while Darnell worked above, and when the final section slid into place with a satisfying metallic click, she felt a small bright spark of something she hadn't felt in months. Accomplishment. That evening she lit the first fire. The flames caught, slowly chewing on the dry kindling she had split with the hatchet, then climbing to the larger pieces with growing confidence. Heat radiated outward in waves. Margery sat in the wooden chair and held her palms toward the warmth, watching the firelight dance across the curved metal walls and turn the rust to copper and gold. The building felt different now, not warm exactly, not yet, but alive. She stayed up late that night reading Herschel's journal by the glow of the stove. His sketches showed a bedroom partition in the southeast corner closest to the heat, a kitchen area to the north near the water source he had mapped from a spring 80 yards uphill, a small porch at the entrance facing west toward the ridge wide enough for 2 chairs. 2 chairs. Margery's eyes lingered on the drawing. Herschel had sketched them carefully. 2 simple chairs side by side facing the mountains. She looked at the single chair she had carried all the way from the old house. It sat beside her now, solid and patient. She touched its armrest and whispered, "I'm working on it." Word traveled as it does in small places, not through announcements or gossip, but through the quiet accumulation of observation. Someone saw Clyde loading supplies. Someone heard Darnell mention the stovepipe. The woman at the diner noticed Margery buying bread every third day, always polite, always exact change, always walking back toward the mountain trail, carrying more than a woman her age should carry. One morning, Margery returned from the spring with her 2 water buckets and found a cardboard box sitting just inside the entrance. No note. Inside were 3 wool blankets, a kerosene lantern, and a bar of soap wrapped in brown paper. She stood there, holding the soap, turning it over in her hands, and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude exactly, something wider than that. The understanding that somewhere in the town below someone had thought about her, not with pity, with recognition. 2 days later, another box appeared. This one held a cast-iron skillet, a bag of cornmeal, and 6 jars of home-canned applesauce with handwritten labels. The handwriting was shaky, deliberate, old. Margery never found out who left the boxes. She didn't ask. Asking would have broken the spell, because what was happening wasn't charity. It was something older and quieter. It was a community deciding without discussion that the woman on the mountain was one of them. The first wall went up on a Thursday. Margery had been studying Herschel's drawings for days, tracing the measurements with her finger, comparing them to the actual space. She bought lumber from Clyde, rough-cut pine from a local mill, imperfect but solid. She measured twice the way Herschel always insisted. She cut with the handsaw because the circular saw frightened her, and she wasn't ready to admit that to Clyde. The first frame she built leaned 7 degrees to the left. She could see the lean without a level. It looked like a door frame in a fun house. She stared at it for a long time, then took it apart piece by piece and started over. The second frame was better, 4 degrees. The third was straight. She checked it with the level Clyde had lent her, and the bubble sat perfectly between the 2 lines. And Margery pressed her hand flat against the wood and felt the grain and the solidity of it, and smiled for the first time in she didn't know how long. One wall, one corner of the building sectioned off into what would become a bedroom. It wasn't much. A wooden frame, no drywall, no insulation, just the skeleton of a room. But it stood. She slept behind it that night, and the difference was remarkable. The wall blocked the draft that usually crept along the floor from the entrance. The stove's heat gathered in the corner instead of dissipating into the vast open space. For the first time since arriving on the mountain, Margery slept through the night without waking from cold. The season turned. September brought shorter days and a sharpness to the air that tasted like iron. The trees on the ridge began their slow transformation, green giving way to amber and rust at the edges working inward like a blush. Margery had been on the mountain for nearly 5 months. The building now had 2 framed walls, a functioning stove, a rain barrel connected to a gutter. She had fashioned from a length of aluminum flashing and a front door, a real door. Built from salvaged barn planks hung on hinges Clyde brought up one afternoon without being asked. It was starting to look like a place where someone lived. That was when Roy Beckford arrived. Margery heard the engine before she saw the vehicle. A black SUV, clean and polished, absurdly out of place on the rutted trail. It stopped at the edge of the clearing and a man stepped out. 50s, pressed khakis, a quilted vest over a collared shirt. The kind of clothes that cost money and were designed to look like they didn't. He wore hiking boots that had never touched mud. He walked toward the building with his hands in his pockets, looking around the clearing with an expression Margery recognized immediately. Appraisal, not admiration, calculation. Mrs. Hollowell. She set down the saw she had been using and straightened up slowly. Who's asking? Roy Beckford. I represent Stonebridge Development Partners. We're working with several landowners in this valley on a conservation and recreation initiative. He smiled. The smile had been practiced. I was hoping we could talk. We're talking. Roy glanced at the building, at the fresh lumber framing the doorway, at the thin curl of smoke from the stovepipe. You've done remarkable work here, truly. But I'll be direct with you, Mrs. Hollowell. This parcel sits in a corridor we've identified for a planned resort and wellness community. We're prepared to offer you $15,000 for the land. That's well above assessed value. Margery looked at him. She had spent 31 years in elementary classrooms. She had seen every negotiation tactic invented by human beings, most of them deployed by 9-year-olds trying to avoid a spelling test. This man was using the same ones, just with bigger words. The land isn't for sale. Roy's smile held. I understand the attachment. I do. But realistically, Mrs. Hollowell, a woman your age living alone up here with no road access, no electricity, no running water, it's not sustainable. Winter in these mountains is serious. I'm offering you a way to walk away comfortably. I didn't walk up this mountain to walk away from it. Something behind Roy's eyes shifted. The smile stayed, but the warmth drained out of it. I'd encourage you to think about it. The offer won't stay open forever. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a business card which he placed on the wooden chair by the door. My number, when you're ready. Margery picked up the card, studied it for a moment, then slid it under the leg of the chair to level a wobble she had been meaning to fix. Good day, Mr. Beckford. He left. The SUV reversed carefully down the trail, and the sound of its engine faded slowly into the trees, until there was nothing left but the wind and the distant call of a hawk circling above the ridge. Margery stood in the clearing, arms folded, watching the empty trail. The encounter had rattled her more than she wanted to admit. Not because of Roy, because of the truth buried inside his words. Winter was coming, she knew that. The nights were already colder. The hike to town was harder each time. And despite everything she had done, the walls, the stove, the door, the building was still not truly weatherproof. Not for a Blue Ridge winter. Not for a woman closer to 80 than 70. She went inside and sat in the chair. Herschel's journal lay open on the crate beside the stove. She turned to the page with the porch sketch. The 2 chairs side by side. I know, she said quietly. I know it's not done yet. The storm arrived 3 weeks later, October 19th. Margery remembered the date because she had been counting the days since the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time, and October 19th was day 11. The sky that morning was the color of iron. By noon, the wind had picked up, bending the treetops in long sweeping arcs. By 3 o'clock, the first rain arrived. Not gentle rain. Hard driving sheets that came sideways off the ridge and hammered the metal walls like 1,000 fists. Margery sealed the door and fed the stove. For a while the building held, the roof patches held, the walls held. She sat in the chair and listened to the storm howl around the curved metal shell and told herself it would pass. By nightfall, it had not passed. It had gotten worse. The wind found the gaps she hadn't sealed. Cold air poured through the seams in the metal she didn't even know existed. The tarp on the roof tore loose on one side, and water began streaming through the crack in steady, relentless rivulets that pooled on the concrete floor and crept toward the stove. Margery moved the crate to higher ground. She stacked blankets on top of it. She tried to stuff rags into the wall seams, but the wind ripped them out as fast as she pushed them in. By midnight, the stove was struggling. Wet wood hissed and sputtered. The heat that had been her only comfort for weeks faded to a faint, inconsistent warmth that barely reached beyond arm's length. Margery sat in the chair with every blanket she owned wrapped around her shoulders. Herschel's journal in her lap and listened to the building groan. The structure shuddered with each gust. Metal panels flexed and popped. Somewhere above her, a rivet gave way with a sharp crack that made her flinch. For the first time since arriving on this mountain, Margery was afraid, not of the storm, of herself, of the possibility that Roy Beckford was right, that Jolene was right, that the world was right and she was just a stubborn old woman who had confused grief with courage and ended up on a mountainside in a building that was trying to come apart around her. She opened the journal. The pages were damp at the edges. She turned to a section near the middle she hadn't read before, past the sketches and the measurements to a page filled with ordinary handwriting. Not plans, not instructions, just words. October 2019. Woke up at 4 this morning. Couldn't sleep. Thinking about Marge again. She doesn't know about this place. Sometimes I wonder if I should just tell her. But I know how she is. She'd say it's too much. She'd say we should sell it and put the money towards something practical. That's the thing about Marge. She always takes care of everyone else first. Always has. She'll want to give the money to Jolene or donate it or put it in the bank where the hospital can find it. But I didn't save it for everyone else. I saved it for her. She's going to want to give up. She always does when things get hard. She'll convince herself it's the reasonable thing to do. She'll tell herself she's being practical. But here's what I know. After 50 years, Marge doesn't quit. She thinks she does, but she doesn't. Every time life knocked her down, she got back up. Every single time. She just never noticed she was doing it. That's the thing I love most about her. Margery read the passage once holding the journal close to the fading stove light. Rain hammered the roof. Wind screamed through the seams. She read it again. Then she closed the journal, pressed it against her chest, and sat in the chair, Herschel's chair, while the storm raged around her, and did not move until morning. When dawn came gray and exhausted, the wind had died to a low murmur. Rain still fell but gently now, almost an apology. Margery opened her eyes. She was still sitting upright in the chair. Every muscle in her body ached. Her fingers were numb. The stove had gone out sometime in the night, and the air inside the building was cold enough to see her breath. Water covered most of the floor. The tarp hung in shreds from the roof. One section of wall framing near the entrance had buckled under the weight of rain pooling on the crossbeam. Margery looked at the damage. She looked at it for a long time. Then she set the journal carefully on the crate, walked to the entrance, and stepped outside into the pale rain-washed morning. The clearing was strewn with branches. The gravel path she had spent weeks building was a river of mud. The mountains beyond the ridge were hidden behind low clouds that clung to the slopes like wet cloth. Margery stood in the doorway, 78 years old, soaked, freezing, every joint screaming, looking at a building that the storm had tried to take apart. She took a breath. Then she walked back inside, found the roofing sealant, and climbed the ladder. The roof took 4 days to repair. Margery worked in sections starting with the worst of it, the long tear where the tarp had ripped free and left the crack exposed to open sky. Her hands were raw by the second morning. The sealant stung every cut and scrape on her fingers. The ladder wobbled beneath her with each gust of residual wind, and twice she had to climb down and sit in the chair until the dizziness passed. She did not call Clyde. She did not hike to town. She did not ask for help, not out of pride, out of something she couldn't quite explain even to herself. The storm had tried to take this place apart, and the only answer that mattered was the one she gave with her own hands. If the building could survive that night, so could she. And if the repair held, it would hold, because she made it hold. On the fourth afternoon, the last section of tarp was sealed weighted and secured with cables she had salvaged from the debris scattered across the clearing. Margery climbed down the ladder for the final time, stood in the middle of the floor, and looked up. No light came through the roof. For the first time since she had arrived on this mountain, the ceiling was solid, complete. A closed sky of metal and patching and stubborn, imperfect effort. She sat in the chair and didn't move for a long time. The stove was burning again. She had spent the previous evening splitting damp wood into thin strips and drying them near the fire pit outside, feeding the driest pieces into the firebox until the flames caught and held. The heat pressed against her face and hands like a living thing. Outside, the mountains were emerging from the clouds. The storm had stripped the last of the autumn leaves from the oaks, and the ridgelines stood bare and angular against the sky, every branch visible, every contour sharp. The world looked cleaned, simplified, reduced to its essential shapes. Margery picked up Herschel's journal and turned to the next page of sketches. The kitchen counter, the water pump, the porch. She had work to do. November arrived cold and clear. The building now had 3 framed walls, a sealed roof, a working stove, and a front door that closed properly against the wind. The kitchen area was taking shape, a rough counter, built from planks Margery had sanded by hand, until the grain was smooth enough to rest a plate on. The rain barrel outside fed a simple gravity line through the wall to a basin she had fashioned from a galvanized tub. It wasn't plumbing. It was closer to engineering by stubbornness. But water came out when she opened the valve, and that was enough. Clyde visited once a week now, usually on Tuesdays, always with something in the bed of his truck he claimed to be getting rid of. A roll of insulation, a box of wood screws, a 5-gallon bucket of exterior paint, forest green, that he said a customer had ordered and never picked up. Margery stopped questioning the frequency of Clyde's uncollected inventory. She simply nodded, helped him unload, and made coffee on the stove while he inspected whatever she had built since his last visit. He rarely praised the work directly. His style was subtraction. If he didn't mention something, it was good. If he lingered on a joint or a seam, it needed redoing. One afternoon, he ran his hand along the kitchen counter and said nothing. Then he tapped it twice with his knuckle turned and picked up his coffee. Margery understood. The counter was fine. The day Darnell Spivey returned, he brought a woman named Eunice Pratt, 68, who had been a student in Margery's 3rd grade class 41 years ago. Eunice was broad-shouldered and brisk, and arrived carrying a casserole dish and a toolbox with equal authority. "Mrs. Hollowell, you probably don't remember me. I sat in the 2nd row near the window. I was the one who couldn't spell February." Margery looked at her for a long moment. "You drew horses on your math worksheets, every single one." Eunice's face softened. She set the casserole on the counter and opened the toolbox. "Darnell says you need help with the wiring." They worked together for 3 days. Eunice knew basic electrical enough to run a line from a small generator Clyde had sourced from somewhere he declined to specify. By the end of the 3rd day, the building had light. A single bulb hanging from a wire above the kitchen area, casting a warm yellow glow that reached every corner of the space. Margery stood beneath it that evening and looked up at the light, the way a person might look at a star. Such a small thing, a 60-watt bulb in a rusted metal building on a mountain. But to Margery, standing in the space she had sealed and framed and wired with her own cracked-aching hands, it was proof. Not of electricity, of continuity, of the accumulated effort of months turned into something visible and warm and real. She was not building a house. She was building evidence that she was still alive. On a Friday morning in mid-November, Margery was outside splitting kindling when she heard a car engine on the trail. Not Clyde's truck. She knew that sound by now, the heavy diesel rattle and the squeak of the left rear spring. This engine was lighter, quieter, a sedan struggling with the ruts. A silver car appeared at the edge of the clearing and stopped. The driver's door opened and a woman stepped out. Jolene. She looked the way she always looked during their infrequent visits, neat, composed, slightly tense around the mouth. She wore a wool coat and leather boots that were already collecting mud. Her eyes moved across the clearing, the gravel path, the building with its new door and patched roof and thin thread of smoke rising from the stovepipe. Her expression was unreadable. Margery set down the hatchet. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The space between them was filled with the particular silence that exists between mothers and daughters who love each other but have forgotten how to say so. You drove 3 hours. 4. There was construction near Charlottesville. You should have called. You don't have a phone that works up here, Mom. That was true. Margery hadn't thought about it as a problem until now. Jolene walked towards the building slowly, her eyes still moving, still cataloging. She stopped at the doorway and looked inside. The framed walls, the stove, the counter, the single bulb glowing above the kitchen, the wooden chair beside the crate. Mom? Her voice was very controlled. This isn't you can't live here. You're 78, it's November. There's no insulation in those walls. There's no real heat source beyond that stove. If you fall, if you get sick, there's no one. There's Clyde and Darnell and Eunice Pratt, who draws horses. Jolene closed her eyes briefly, the way people do when they are trying to hold something back. I'm serious. I talked to a place in Richmond, Sunrise Gardens. It's a residential community, not a nursing home. You'd have your own room meals activities. Jolene, they have a garden. You always liked to come inside. Margery walked through the doorway. After a moment, Jolene followed. The interior was dim and warm, the stove ticking softly as the firewood settled. Margery crossed to the crate and lifted the oilcloth. Your father left this. She handed Jolene the journal. Jolene took it. She opened it to the first page, the letter, and began reading. Margery watched her daughter's face in the stove light. Watched the controlled expression hold for the first paragraph, then flicker during the second. By the third, something was coming apart behind Jolene's eyes slowly, the way ice breaks on a pond in early spring. Not all at once, but in long branching cracks that spread outward until the surface can no longer hold. Jolene turned the page. The sketches, the floor plans, the measurements written in Herschel's careful hand, the notes in the margins, pine for the framing, oak for the counter. Make sure the porch faces west. Marge likes the sunset. Jolene's hand came up to her mouth. She turned another page, another. The kitchen design, the bedroom partition, the rain catchment system, the porch with 2 chairs drawn in precise detail, each one labeled with a single letter, M and H. Jolene sat down heavily on the concrete floor. The journal rested open in her lap. Her shoulders began to shake. He never told me. Her voice was barely a whisper. All those years, all those weekends he spent in the workshop. I thought he was I didn't know he was. Neither did I. Jolene looked up. Her eyes were red and wet, and in them Margery saw something she hadn't seen in years. Not the careful, competent, slightly distant woman her daughter had become. The girl who used to sit on Herschel's lap in the workshop and hand him nails one at a time, asking what each tool was called and what it was for. He loved you so much, Mom. Margery sat down beside her daughter on the floor. Their shoulders touched. Jolene leaned into her, and Margery put her arm around her, and they sat there together in the warm, dim space while the stove crackled, and the single bulb hummed, and the mountains outside turned gold in the late afternoon light. Jolene stayed for a week. She slept on a cot Clyde brought up, wedged into the corner behind the bedroom wall. She complained about the cold. She complained about the outhouse Margery had built 50 yards into the trees. She complained about the lack of cell service, the absence of a mirror, the fact that coffee made on a wood stove tasted like smoke. and every morning she got up and worked. She wasn't skilled with tools. She hit a thumb with a hammer on the second day and swore loudly enough that a pair of crows lifted off the nearest pine tree in alarm. But she held boards steady while Margery cut them. She carried insulation from the truck to the building without complaining about the fiberglass itching her arms. She sanded, she swept, she painted the front door with the green paint Clyde had left. And when she finished, she stood back and looked at it with an expression Margery recognized. The same expression Margery had seen in her own reflection the day she built the first wall that stood straight. On her last night, Jolene sat beside Margery on the wooden chair just inside the entrance, both of them looking out at the clearing in the blue dusk. The mountains were dark silhouettes against a sky that still held the faintest trace of light. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." Margery shook her head. "You're here now." A long silence. An owl called from somewhere deep in the trees. The stove popped and settled behind them. "I'll come back next month. I'll bring more insulation." "Bring yourself, that's enough." Jolene left the next morning. Margery watched the silver car disappear down the trail and stood in the clearing until she couldn't hear the engine anymore. Then she went inside and put a second nail in the wall beside the kitchen counter. She hung a small framed photograph Jolene had brought from Richmond Herschel Margery and Jolene at the beach in 1989. Herschel squinting into the sun, Jolene on his shoulders, Margery beside them laughing at something no one could remember. December. The building had walls, now real walls insulated, and sheathed, dividing the open space into rooms that held warmth and kept out wind. The kitchen was functional. The bedroom was small but dry and warm with a window. Margery had installed herself slightly crooked, sealed with caulk. She applied too thick, but it framed a view of the ridgeline that made waking up every morning feel like opening a letter. One Tuesday, Clyde arrived with a load of lumber for the porch. They worked together through the afternoon, framing the platform, setting the posts, laying the deckboards. Clyde didn't talk much while he worked. He measured, he cut, he fastened. Occasionally he would pause, look at a joint, and make a small sound of satisfaction or disapproval, and that was the extent of his commentary. Near the end of the day, as they nailed the last railing into place, Clyde straightened up and looked at the finished porch. Then he looked at the building. Then he looked at Margery. Herschel would have been proud of this. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without decoration. And that was exactly what made it land. Margery nodded once. She didn't trust her voice. That evening after Clyde left, Margery moved the wooden chair onto the porch for the first time. She sat down in it, pulled a blanket around her shoulders, and watched the sun set over the Blue Ridge. The light came in long slanting bands through the bare trees, turning the clearing amber, and then rose, and then a deep quiet violet that seemed to hum. The porch faced west, just as Herschel had drawn it. She sat there until the stars appeared. 2 days later, Margery was cleaning the last section of the building she hadn't touched. The far corner behind a metal panel that had been bolted to the wall and partially hidden by debris she had cleared months ago but never moved completely. She had been meaning to get to it, but other projects had always taken priority. Now, with the building mostly finished, there was nothing left to avoid. She loosened the bolts with a wrench. The panel groaned as she pried it free and leaned it against the wall. Behind it was a small alcove in the curved metal shell, a natural pocket in the structure's design, maybe 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide. Inside the alcove, standing upright against the back wall, wrapped in a painter's drop cloth that had gone stiff with age, was something solid, something rectangular. Margery pulled the drop cloth free. A chair, an oak chair with smooth armrests and a slightly curved back, and 2 coats of varnish faded to a soft golden color. Dovetail joints at every corner, no nails, handmade, identical to the one sitting on the porch. Margery's hand went to the armrest. She ran her fingers along the wood slowly, the way a person touches something they are afraid might disappear. The grain was the same. The finish was the same. even the slight curve at the end of each armrest. The small design detail Herschel always added to his chairs, because he said a person's hand should have somewhere to rest, was exactly the same. He had built this chair here, in this building. Years ago, maybe decades ago, during one of those long weekends, he told her he was working on a side job. He had carried the wood up the mountain, cut it, shaped it, joined it, finished it, and placed it in this alcove behind this panel wrapped in cloth, waiting for her. Margery carried the chair outside and set it on the porch beside the first one. Two chairs side by side facing the mountains, exactly as Herschel had drawn them in the journal. M and H. She sat in her chair, the one she had carried on a bus and up a mountain and through a storm, the one that had been with her since the beginning. And beside her, close enough to touch, was the one Herschel had placed here long before she knew she would need it. The clearing was quiet. Late afternoon light moved through the bare trees in pale gold columns. Somewhere on the ridge, a woodpecker drummed a slow, steady rhythm against a hollow trunk. The air smelled of pine sap and cold earth and the faintest trace of wood smoke from the stove. Margery reached over and rested her hand on the armrest of Herschel's chair. The wood was cold from years of waiting, but it was solid, it was real, and it was here. 3 days before Christmas, Roy Beckford returned. Margery heard the SUV before she saw it. She was sitting on the porch in the thin winter sunlight, reading the stove burning steadily inside. She closed the book and waited. Roy walked across the clearing looking different than before. The polished confidence was still there, but something else had crept in underneath it. Fatigue, maybe, or the particular tension of a man who has been told no and doesn't know what to do with it. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at her. His eyes moved to the two chairs, lingered there for a moment. "Mrs. Hollowell, I hope I'm not intruding." "You are, but you're here, so sit down." She gestured to Herschel's chair. Roy hesitated, then climbed the steps and sat. The chair held him easily. He seemed surprised by how comfortable it was. Margery went inside and came back with 2 mugs of tea. She handed him one. He took it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The view from the porch stretched across the clearing to the ridge, where the bare trees stood in fine dark lines against the sky. A light dusting of snow had fallen the night before, just enough to cover the ground in white. "I'm authorized to offer 50,000. Margery took a sip of her tea. "Do you know why I won't sell this place, Mr. Beckford?" Roy looked at her. "This isn't land. This isn't property. This is the last promise my husband ever kept." She held the mug in both hands, feeling the warmth through the ceramic. "He told me 53 years ago he'd build me a place in these mountains." I laughed. He didn't. He spent 35 years getting it ready, and he never said a word. He hid money in jars so no hospital could take it. He drew every wall, every window, every beam. He built a chair and wrapped it in cloth and left it here for the day I'd need somewhere to sit. She looked out at the ridge. "You can't put a price on a promise like that. And I wouldn't insult his memory by trying." Roy sat very still, his tea cooled in his hands. The wind moved across the clearing, carrying a few flakes of snow that drifted between them like small, slow thoughts. After a long time, he stood. He set the mug on the railing. "I'm sorry to have bothered you, Mrs. Hollowell." He walked to his car. The engine started. The SUV rolled slowly down the trail, and this time Margery knew it would not come back. She sat on the porch until the sound was gone. Then she reached over and rested her hand on the armrest of Herschel's chair, again the way she used to reach for his hand during long drives without looking, knowing exactly where it would be. "You kept your word, Herschel." The mountains held still. Snow fell lightly through the last of the afternoon light, settling on the railing on the roof on the armrest of the empty chair beside her. The stove glowed behind the window, its warmth reaching all the way to the porch. Inside, the single bulb burned steadily above the kitchen counter, where the photograph of 3 people at the beach caught the light in its small wooden frame. The building that had once been a rusted shell forgotten by the world was something else now. Its green door was closed against the cold. Smoke curled from the stovepipe. Two chairs sat on the porch side by side, facing west, where the sun was lowering itself gently behind the Blue Ridge painting, the snow in shades of rose and copper and deep fading gold. One chair was occupied. The other was empty, but not in the way that empty things are usually empty, not absent, not lacking. It was the kind of empty that holds something, the way a room still holds the sound of a voice after the person has stopped speaking. The way the space beside you in bed still holds the warmth of someone who was there. Margery lifted her mug. The tea was almost cold now, but she drank it anyway, slowly watching the color drain from the sky and the first stars appear above the ridge. The snow fell so softly it made no sound at all. The only noise was the stove behind her, ticking and settling, and the distant patient silence of a mountain that had learned to wait. Somewhere below in the small town with the diner and the hardware store, Clyde Fenton was closing up shop. Eunice Pratt was feeding her horses. Dorothea Ainsley was filing papers in the county office, and on a shelf behind her desk, a folder labeled, Hollowell sat closed and complete. And up on the mountain, in a home that had cost $10 and taken 53 years to build, a woman who had once believed the world had no place left for her, sat in a chair. Her husband made beside a chair. Her husband left and watched the night come gently down. She didn't feel invisible anymore. If this story reached you tonight, subscribe and stay a while. And tell us in the comments, what's the most important promise someone ever kept for you?